This is the UK Tonight, live from Southport this evening, a town still in shock after the murder of 3 young girls at a dance class here almost 6 months ago. Today, their killer was jailed for life. Our worlds have been shattered and turned upside down. The families of the victims make emotional statements in court today as the attacker is sentenced. Axel Rudakubana is jailed for a minimum term of 52 years, the judge saying it's likely he will never be released. Dashcam footage is released of Rudakubana entering the dance studio where he carried out his brutal, premeditated attack.
It was of such extreme violence, of the utmost and exceptionally high seriousness, that it is difficult to comprehend why it was done.
The Prime Minister calls the attack one of the most harrowing moments in our country's history as he pledges to deliver the change the victims deserve. Tonight, we'll hear from the community here in Southport, still so far away from processing the tragic events of last July. Good evening to you from Southport, a community which for the last 6 months has been united in shock and grief over the murder of 3 young girls at a dance studio here in this town. Alice De Silva Aguirre, Elsie Stankham and BB King were at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class when they were killed by Axel Rudakubana in a premeditated attack that shocked the country. 8 other children and 2 adults were injured as Rudakubana, who was 17 at the time, stabbed his unsuspecting victims in an attack that we learned today lasted almost 15 minutes. Earlier today, he was sentenced to a minimum of 52 years in prison, but for many of the families in this town, their sentence is really only just beginning. The parents of one of Rudakubana's victims telling the court today that their world had been shattered and turned upside down. Our chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, has our first report tonight, and just to warn you that it does contain some very distressing details.
This is Axel Rudakubana on July the 29th, on his way to carry out a knife attack on a class full of young girls. At the bus stop, he paces up and down while phoning for a taxi. On that 5-mile journey, he's silent until the very end, when he checks he's at the right address.
Number 34A, yeah.
After he refused to pay, the taxi dash cam records him approaching the door of the dance studio, looking to find his way in. We know what happened next. Inside, 26 girls were enjoying a Taylor Swift dance event at the start of the summer holidays, an event that had sold out. The girls were at a table making friendship bracelets when, without a word, Rudakubana entered and grabbed the child nearest to him. He then moved on to a second and a third, lunging at them. Leanne Lucas, who was running the class that day, said she only realised what was happening when she felt a knife go into her back. Some people left the courtroom because the details of what happened here that day were so graphic. The court was played CCTV footage in which the screams of children can be heard. Leanne Lucas is seen trying to usher them to safety. One child tries to leave the building but is pulled back in by Rudakubana. She was one of the injured. Deanna here, KC, said the injuries sustained by 2 of the children who died could only be described as sadistic in nature. BB King, Elsie Stankham and Alice Aguirre died in the attack. 8 other girls were injured. The court heard Rudakubana's only intention that day was to kill. After he was arrested, he told police, "It's a good thing those children are dead. I'm so glad. I'm so happy." Among the weapons at his home, police found a second knife, identical to the one used in the attack. They also found evidence of his obsession with violence. In the dock, Rudakubana began shouting that he was ill and needed to see a paramedic, with the families of the victims listening in court. When he refused to stop, the judge ordered him to be removed. We then heard from some of those whose lives have been changed by the events of that day, including one of the girls who was injured. "The beginning of my nightmare," she said, "started when I saw you. I thought you were playing a joke. I saw you in your green hoodie and face mask. The thing I remember most about you is your eyes. You looked possessed. You didn't look human." Leanne Lucas also addressed the court.
I cannot give myself compassion or accept praise. as how can I live knowing I survived when children died. The trauma of being both a victim and a witness has been horrendous. The impact this has had on me can be summed up by one word: trauma. He targeted us because we were women and girls, vulnerable and easy prey.
There was a statement from the parents of Alice.
Alice was always a very kind girl who valued equality and fairness at the core. A world of possibilities awaited her, a best friend anyone could ask for. We were so lucky and privileged to have her. Every day felt like a gift. In a matter of minutes, our worlds were shattered and turned upside down by the devastating attack on our Alice. A pin drop that changed our lives forever. We kept our hopes up every second during Alice's 14-hour fight, but once she'd lost a fight, we lost our lives. Everything stopped still, and we froze in time and space. Our life went with her. He took us too.
And from Elsie's mum.
You deliberately chose that place, fully aware that there would be no parents present, fully aware that girls were vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. We were robbed of the opportunity to protect our girls. What you did was not only cruel and pure evil, it was the act of a coward.
Rudakubana wasn't in court to hear any of that, or the judge sentence him.
The prosecution have made it clear that these proceedings were not acts of terrorism within the meaning of the terrorism legislation, because there is no evidence that Rudakubana's purpose was to advance political, religious, racial or ideological cause. I must accept that conclusion. However, in my judgment, his culpability for this extreme level of violence is equivalent in its seriousness to terrorist murders, whatever his purpose. Whether his motivation was for terrorism or not misses the point. What he did on the 29th of July last year has caused such shock and revulsion to the whole nation that it must be viewed as being at the very extreme level of crime. His culpability and the harm he caused and intended were at the highest. I'm now going to sentence Axel Rudakubana, having explained my reasons. On counts 1 to 3 murder, I sentence him to custody for life with a minimum term which he must serve in custody of 52 years, less the time he's served already.
Police say they've never established why Rudakubana chose that venue, those girls, as his target.
He's just the most despicable young person who's committed the most vile and violent acts that are going to have an impact on the victims and their families for the rest of their lives. Words almost fail to describe him in terms of just what a despicable person he is.
The judge said it is highly unlikely Rudakubana will ever be released, but so many questions remain, and all of it has come too late for the so many lives altered and the young lives lost. Greg Milam, Sky News, Southport.
Well, Greg is here alongside me in Southport tonight, our Chief North of England correspondent, whose report you heard there, Greg Milam, and our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, who's been alongside me in Liverpool earlier today as we brought you all the details coming out of court in real time. And Greg, let's talk about Southport, where we are tonight. Not too far from where the attack unfolded. And you've spent a lot of time in this community covering this story. What has been the reaction to today's events and today's sentencing?
I think it's worth remembering that for a lot of people, even the families of those children who died, they'd not heard all of this detail before this week also, and they're learning it as the rest are learning it, and how shocking it is. And I think what's striking is the scale. When we're talking about the 3 children who died and their families dealing with all of this, the children who were injured and their families, and also those other children who were there who weren't injured but witnessed everything that was going on. You realise just how many people this touched, aside from the people who were there on the scene trying to help on that day. You realise just the scale and the scope of the effect. And we heard it in those victim impact statements, and that very brave young girl who talked about running for her life. And of course she'll live with that for the rest of her life. Elsie's family has issued a statement tonight, talking about how wrong it is that someone who's grown up in our society can commit such an unspeakable act of hatred, as they described it. They've welcomed that public inquiry because, of course, this will go on. And John Hayes, who was one of the adults who was injured, has said to me, it doesn't end here. We've got the public inquiry. We've got to live through that. And he doesn't believe it will make much difference. He said they've known this information and nothing will bring those 3 girls back. And I think that, for everybody here, certainly is the overriding emotion.
Martin, let's talk about the sentence that was handed down at the end of today's proceedings to Axel Rudakubana, a life sentence with a minimum of 52 years, one of the longest handed out.
I think it must be perhaps the longest sentence for a non-terror conviction. I suppose if you go back, and I do go back a long way, David Copeland, the nail bomber in the late 90s, got a 50-year minimum sentence. But of course, he didn't kill anything like, he didn't injure or kill anything like the numbers that Rudakubana has done. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, seemed to show some surprise that it wasn't designated as a terror offence. You know, he said, I have to accept that. But he went on to say that it was as serious as a terror offence. And really, I think that's what prompted him to give such a big minimum sentence. And I think, again, he did rather suggest that, but for his age, he would have given him a whole life sentence, which would have meant that he would never be released. I mean, I suppose the upshot of going to prison for 52 years minimum, which means he'll be 70 when he gets the first opportunity to ask for parole. No guarantee that he would ever get it. I think it's probably tantamount to a whole life sentence. In fact, the judge, I think, said he didn't really expect him to ever be released.
OK. Martin Gregg for the moment. Thank you. More details emerging in court today, as Greg and Martin have been reflecting on there. Details about the contact that he had with authorities before the Southport attack and the possible warnings that appear to have been missed. Our national correspondent Tom Parmenter takes a look at that in his report.
This atrocity was planned out here, inside the family home on a quiet cul-de-sac in a village 4 miles from Southport. The police discovered a stash of weapons, a machete, a set of arrows. From here, he'd researched conflicts all over the world, beheadings, terrorism and genocide. Under his bed was this Tupperware container. Tests later showed it contained the deadly toxin ricin. There's no evidence that he used it, but he'd ordered the ingredients online and made it himself.
All of the evidence that we found in relation to him shows that he was obsessed with violence. The planning shows that he was intent that day on going out to commit mass murder. What we don't know, because we've never found it, is that the ideology, that's just not there. It was more a suggestion that he was probably more socially isolated than being radicalised by anybody.
What has been the input from his immediate family into your investigation?
So we still have a live investigation ongoing, so I'm unable to answer any questions in relation to the parents at this stage.
A lot of people watching this will wonder what that means.
We have a live investigation ongoing, and that is something that we are still looking into.
This footage shows Rudakubana in a taxi a week before the attack. He intended to head to the high school he was expelled from in 2019. The man on the street is his father. The police have blurred his image. He eventually persuades his son not to make that journey, and Rudakubana gets out of the taxi. The court was told it was likely to be an attempt to carry out a similar attack. The red flags stretch back to 2019 and a catalogue of incidents over the years. Among them, he'd been caught looking up school massacres while in class. During a call to Childline, he asked, "What do I do if I want to kill somebody?" And when the police stopped him on another occasion, he had a knife. He told the officers he wanted to stab someone. A long list of worrying behaviour meant he was on the radar of multiple authorities, including the police, mental health and children's services. He'd also been referred several times to Prevent, the counter-terrorism programme, but his case was not escalated.
It is right that questions are asked about what more needs to be done across the whole Prevent system and beyond. Many threads have to come together if we are to stop children and vulnerable people being led towards violence and extremism, including better and earlier identification of those at risk and reducing the ready access to weapons and horrific toxic online material.
There will be a full inquiry, but we already know this teenager could have been stopped, and the investigation into him and his family is not yet over. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
Let's bring in now Nazir Afzal, former Chief Prosecutor for the North West of England. Good of you to come on to the programme tonight to react to today's events. Perhaps I could just start by asking you to reflect there on Tom Parmenter's report and big questions asked about why so many signs were missed by a whole range of agencies when it came to the suspect and the man convicted today.
Good evening. Sadly, the experience that Tom outlined is not unusual. We've had a series of, over the last few years, situations, terrible tragedies, which could have been avoided if somebody somewhere had done their job better. What we have in this particular case is a number of authorities were engaged, local government, the Prevent team, schools, colleges, the police themselves. And all of them seemed to miss the risk or decided that the risk was minimal. And they didn't seem, it would appear to me, to share information in terms of what they knew and what they thought would happen. And as a result, the lack of intervention, the lack of any intervention, the lack of any support that he might have needed, the lack of any legal action. You could have done all sorts of legal actions which would prevent him from doing what he did, has led to these terrible crimes. And I'll be honest with you, it is no doubt in my mind, had people done their job better in the last few years in relation to this man, those girls would still be alive.
Sorry, Nazir, I was asking for my mic to be cut because I can't actually hear what you're saying. We've got a slight technical difficulty. So I'm going to ask you another question. I know you can hear me. I wanted to ask you about redefining the definition of terror and how you feel that may have helped in this case, because that has been a subject this week. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, saying that may well now be a priority going forward.
The Prime Minister is right. The terrorism definition for some 2 decades now has been around ideology, politics or religion. So if somebody's motivated by some ideology or by their politics or by religion, then that amounts to terrorism in those circumstances. And what the Prime Minister has said, and others have been saying for some time now, that the threat has changed. There are now people in our communities, in this country, globally, who are motivated not by those things. And very often they're motivated actually by misogyny. What we found here, I don't know what motivated this particular killer. What I do know is that his victims were 3 girls. And only yesterday we had this crossbow killer who killed 3 women, and 2 other women were killed over the weekend. There appears, to my mind, to be a war on women. And misogyny is something that, quite frankly, ought to be treated as terrorism when it happens in these circumstances. So yes, the legislation needs changing, the definition needs changing to recognise that the threat has changed and that people might be driven by something that previously they weren't captured by under the terrorism legislation.
Nazir, you made a really good point there that I could actually hear about the attack on women and girls, and there is a word for it, and that is femicide, and it's probably not used enough. Can I just ask you a couple of questions, because there's a lot I want to talk to you about tonight, but we, as always, have limited time. Another contentious issue in the last 5 to 6 months, particularly for the people here in Southport, is the lack of information from the attack until now. No releasing of information. That has created a vacuum that has been filled, some would say, by misinformation and a lot of anger. The CPS was behind the decision not to release information. The police wanted to release more. What do you make of that decision not to release certain details that we only found out about today in court?
Ultimately, the CPS are responsible for presenting the strongest case before a court. As has been said, and I've said previously, Sarah-Jane, the barrier to releasing more information is the law. The law in 1981, the Contempt of Court Act, which was passed by Margaret Thatcher's government, made it very clear that we should not publish anything that might prejudice a jury against the defendant. And in this case, the information that we now know, the prevent searches or prevent meetings, the previous involvement of police, etc., all of that would be prejudicial and would ultimately lead to a trial not being fair and potentially the killer going free. And so the legislation needs changing. I'll be honest with you, again, social media has changed all the rules. Maybe 30 years ago, when the only people you had to control were the mainstream media, you could do that with the Contempt of Court or Contempt Act. Well, you can't do that anymore with social media. But one has to recognize we have a basic principle, Sarah-Jane, and that is you are innocent until proven guilty. That's what's happened in this case. He has been proven guilty by his guilty plea and the evidence being provided to the court. What that would have been damaged had all this information about his background come out in the last 4 or 5 months. We need a conversation, a national conversation about what should be appropriate in these circumstances. What the police did in these circumstances, what the prosecutors did in these circumstances, was what the law required them to do.
Okay, and Nazir, a final question. My colleague Sophie Ridge earlier tonight asked the local MP here in Southport about the sentence that was handed down, and he supports a change in the law to allow a maximum prison term, and that was something that the Conservative leader Kevin Badenoch commented on tonight, a change into law to leave it up to the judge's discretion to apply a whole life order to somebody under age. What do you make of those proposals?
I mean, this is, as horrible as this is, and this is really horrible. I've seen really horrible things in my life, and anything involving children is the most horrible. We need to recognise that the law already stipulates a life sentence. The law already offers the judge the opportunity to give a minimum sentence. And in this case, 52 years is probably the longest anybody's received for a non-terror offence. I have no problem with it. If Parliament decides that they want to set a set sentence in these circumstances, a maximum sentence, which in this case would be life and meaning life, then there's no reason why that can't be done. But within the current law, what the judge did is all that the judge could do.
Nazir Afzal, former chief prosecutor here in the northwest of England, thank you for your time tonight. Some really important points I wanted to discuss with you, so thank you for taking us through them. As to come on this special edition of the UK Tonight, we'll bring you some details from the victim impact statements that were read out in court earlier today and the harrowing stories of those left behind. And where do the people of Southport go from here? I'll be joined by local leaders trying to rebuild this community.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
An enormous explosion that's just come down. I think it was a monster just landed in between us.
Hundreds and hundreds of people hoping to get north, ultimately to get to the United States.
It's a border where they're not welcome, yet they keep coming.
We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people, taking them out and putting them into trucks and taking them away.
They make about 50 kilos of fentanyl a week. It's incredibly dangerous and toxic stuff.
There's been an upsurge in deaths. The fighting between the gangs is getting more and more vicious.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades, which is over there.
this is much more like a normal town.
It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change.
We've been crushed. Free from wherever you get your news. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. This is real, hardcore emergency medicine. The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world. Sky News, the full story first.
Hundreds of thousands of people have been using the beast for years to traverse Mexico, but it is really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, it would appear, is about to learn his fate. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. Sky News, get the full story first. Do you fear a fourth indictment?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Now, one of the most harrowing aspects of today's proceedings was hearing the details contained in some of the victim impact statements. They were read out in court ahead of sentencing. We're going to take you through some of them now, and I do have to warn you that some of them are extremely distressing. Alexandra and Sergio Aguiar, the parents of Alice da Silva Aguiar, had this to say in court. In a matter of minutes, our worlds were shattered and turned upside down by the devastating attack on our Alice. A pin drop that changed our lives forever. We kept our hopes up every second during Alice's 14-hour fight. But once she had lost her fight, we lost our lives. Our life went with her. He took us too. 6 months of continuous pain and a lifetime sentence. That's what we got then and the life we live now. Our dream girl has been taken away in such a horrible, undeserving way that it shattered our souls. The mother of Elsie Dot Stankham, Jenny Stankham, stood up in court today and said Axel Rudakubana was cruel and pure evil, adding his attack was the act of a coward. In her statement, she said, "The nature of your actions is beyond contempt. You deliberately chose that place, fully aware that there would be no parents present, fully aware that those girls were vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. This was not an act of impulse, it was premeditated. We're not going to stand here and list everything you have taken away from us because we refuse to give you the satisfaction of hearing it. We will not let you know anything about her because you don't deserve to know the extraordinary person she was. You know what you have done, and we hope the weight of that knowledge haunts you every single day. There is nothing that can undo the damage he has caused, but knowing that he will never be free to cause any harm to vulnerable children again would give us a small measure of justice. Perhaps he will have the opportunity to contemplate the fear and terror he inflicted upon those girls. And we sincerely want the consequences to reflect the irreparable damage he has inflicted," the parents speaking before sentencing. Finally, this is what the dance instructor Leanne Lucas had to say today. The judge, in his remarks, commending her for her brave action, saving so many lives. She said, "As a 36-year-old woman, I cannot stay in my own home alone. As a 36-year-old woman, I cannot go to work. As a 36-year-old woman, I cannot walk down the street without holding my breath as I bypass a person and then glance back to see if they've attempted to stab me. As a 36-year-old woman, I cannot give myself compassion or accept praise, as how can I live, knowing I survived when children died? I spent many months thinking about the incident, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I constantly see his face. New memories have appeared, and this will continue to happen for the rest of my life. The trauma of being both a victim and a witness has been horrendous. There are times when I'll spiral into trauma, and the effect this has had on me and those close to me is unforgivable. The impact this has had on me can be summed up by one word: trauma. He targeted us because we were women and girls, vulnerable and easy prey. To discover that he had always set out to hurt the vulnerable is beyond comprehensible. For Alice, Elsie, Bibi, Heidi and the surviving girls, I am surviving for you. Well, for many of us, what we heard in court today brought back the chilling memories of that dreadful day last summer. But for the people of Southport, especially the families and survivors, it's a reality that they have been forced to live with every day, and they will for the rest of their lives. How do you even begin to rebuild a community shattered by those events? Well, with me now, Andrew Brown, founder of community website Stand Up for Southport, the leader of Sefton Council, Marion Atkinson, and Ben Roberts-Haslam from the Liverpool Echo. Thank you all so much. Marion, I can see you're in tears. It's okay, we've all shed a few tears today. It's been a really emotional and hard day for everyone. And I know that you've all been following this closely, as has everyone in this town. Ben, I'll come to you first because we had a lot of contact in that week in Southport after the attack. You were very close to this story and following it, and I know you were across all the information coming out of court today. What has been the effect of this hearing and this sentence?
I don't think we'll ever truly know the effect that this has had on the community or on the people who have been directly impacted by the tragedy that happened here in July. Those victim impact statements they're just a snippet of their lives. They're just a snippet of what those people are feeling, and no one standing here today will ever be able to understand how they feel. People were moved, people were in tears in my office across the country.
Yeah.
Reading and hearing what was said in court today, it was just utterly devastating.
Yeah. Marion, it's been a tough day, hasn't it, for everyone? And how does this community move on now? Because they were steeling themselves for a long trial, having to relive the events of last summer. It ended up being a day, an intense day for everyone. But from people you speak to, they say now is the time that they can start to heal. But after what we've heard in court today, that is not going to be easy. So where do people begin?
So you're right. I don't think tomorrow, it isn't about tomorrow and healing. This is going to take a long time for this community. But also, first and foremost, our thoughts are with the families and what they've been through today. Absolutely horrendous. There is help and support out there for the wider community. There is help and support out there for our children within this community. And I urge anybody who may not need it now, but may need it in the future, please reach out to us. We have got support in place.
Yeah. A lot of that coming from official channels, but I know the community as well, with fundraising efforts, with, people reaching out, different organisations, whether it be faith organisations, community groups. And Andrew, Stand Up for Southport, you want to create a positive voice for Southport because, from the people I've spoken to here in this town, they said what happened over the summer, they do not want to define the town. There is so much good here, and that starts with the people, many of whom I met over the summer, who came out from their houses to Hart Street to offer solace to one another because big town, small community.
Completely, and we're standing in the town hall gardens now, and in the summer this was just full of flowers and teddy bears and handwritten notes and parents and children and grandparents coming to show their emotions and support for one another. And then the vigil, again, thousands of people here, and it's such a small community but such a close-knit, warm, friendly community, and people really did come together. But they've done so much fundraising, and the volunteers have tended the flowers, and we've had so many events. But Southport will continue support because the families, this is an ongoing healing process. They're going to need an awful lot of support. But there's so many families affected by this tragedy. The families of the children who died, but the children who were wounded, the children who were there, their classmates in school, the schools who've cared for them, and this is a massive effect on a small town, and they're going to need so much help going forward. But we know as a community that we'll be there with them, and people will give them every support that we can.
So many victims in all of this, and in fact the victim impact statements that were read out in court, the judge said were only a selection of those that were submitted. Such has been the effect on this in terms of who's directly impacted, and of course the wider community, the ripple effect. Ben, the focus on Southport will return because of a public inquiry. And I just want to gauge from all three of you, actually, the reaction to that in terms of so many questions perhaps were answered for people today, but there are wider questions, particularly about how this young man came to carry out such an act, being known to local authorities. All of those bigger questions still to be tackled. What's the mood here in Southport like about a public inquiry and the attention that will bring?
People want answers. You know, it's been revealed that there are many, many missed opportunities along the way here. Starting in 2019, from the incident at his former high school, where he assaulted a former pupil, all the way up until kind of referrals from, you know, his special educational needs college about his lack of attendance and reports of him not leaving the house. It's almost unimaginable how many missed opportunities have come about from this. And a public inquiry, the quick reaction from the Home Secretary was very much a welcome reaction, I think, for the communities and most importantly for those people who've been directly impacted by this. And I think it's going to take a long time, and like Marion said, it's going to take years for this town to heal, but that is one step in the right direction.
Yeah, Marion, your thoughts on a public inquiry, because public inquiries are big, they are a long process, people will be called to give evidence, and it can re-traumatise people. So again, it's welcome, but the reality of a public inquiry is, you know, is quite hard for people sometimes.
Yes, it absolutely is welcome. I think, as Ben said, people want answers, and I welcome the swiftness of what the government said they were going to do it with. So yes, I think, you know, but again, it's more important really that when these things do start and they do kick in, that we're all here for the community, whatever they need, and the support that we've got in place. If we need to change that or we need to tweak it, then we'll do that to make sure that our residents and our community gets what it needs.
Andrew?
Well, I think that the main voices, the voices that matter, are the voices of the families. I think because of the impending trial, they've not been able to say anything, not been able to prejudice the trial, and finally, now that the sentencing has happened, the people who were there and the families are now able to speak. They've got their voices back, and I'll be interested to hear what they think, but it'll be their chance to say what they feel, and I think that's to determine where we go from here.
Well, that is to come in the fullness of time. But for now, Marion Atkinson, leader of Sefton Council, thank you for your time. Alongside Andrew Brown, their founder for Stand Up for Southport, a positive voice in all of this negativity at the moment, and Ben Roberts-Haslam, who has been covering the story from the start for the Liverpool Echo. Thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we have just had this in from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. She's had this to say after today's hearing and sentencing. She says the whole country has been horrified beyond words by these truly horrendous, cowardly and evil crimes. We will always remember Bibi, Elsie and Alice and the happiness they brought to their families in their short lives. And we will remember too the strength and bravery shown by the survivors of this horrific attack and the astounding courage of those who rushed towards danger and undoubtedly saved many more lives. The police and emergency services who responded that day deserve our eternal gratitude. And we thank too the investigators and prosecutors who have worked so hard for justice, and Mr. Justice Goose for presiding over these hugely difficult proceedings. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, going on to say, we have vowed to get the answers the country deserves about how this horror was allowed to happen and to ensure that lessons are learned. I will set out further details of the independent public inquiry soon, but for today, all our thoughts are with the families enduring this unimaginable pain and the example of strength and courage they have provided to us all. That is a statement that's just come into us within the last few minutes from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. Well, ahead of today's sentencing, I sat down with Mark Foreman, who has been an instrumental figure in raising funds for the families of the victims. I sat down with him and started by asking him to reflect on what life has been like here in Southport over the past 6 months.
I don't think many words could actually express what people are feeling, with the exception of hurt, pain, grieving, surprise, frustration and anger ever since the atrocity happened. The people have been dealing and wondering and just asking themselves, why did it happen? How did it get to this point? What on earth would somebody do this to somebody in Southport, or to two people in Southport? Southport's not known for anything like this. It's probably more known for the only lawnmower museum in the UK, or the longest iron pear, or the second biggest. It's not known for anything like this, and now it is. So over the last 5 months, people are coming to terms with just why this atrocity has happened.
How did the events of that day affect you?
I remember going to the gym first thing in the morning the next day and just not able to do anything. I'm on the treadmill and I'm trying to focus. I'm crying, and I'm the only person there who's not working out, who's not doing it. And it affected me the way that I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to feel. Somebody had come into my town and done these atrocities, done this hideous crime that, you know, if you speak to any of the people in Southport, this sort of thing doesn't happen here.
Mark, do you think Southport will ever recover from what happened here?
I think it will recover, and unlike with the grieving process, that if a relative or somebody close to you dies, it does take time. And I guess it's the trauma thing of ups and downs, and things will, little traumas or little T's or big T's, to say what affects you more going forth. And people will get on, and people will start coming back to Southport. And I mean, if you walk down the high street and if you walk to our parks and the schools and everything, people are getting on, and people are getting on with their own lives. But it's been tainted. It's been tainted from the actions of one individual and obviously the rioters the next night. And we are getting on, and we are grieving.
This week, Southport was steeling itself for a trial, a long trial, having to relive the trauma of the events of the summer. That all changed on Monday when a guilty plea was entered. What was the reaction to that? Because you were getting ready for the long haul, steeling yourself mentally for that.
There's a sense of relief, but there's also a sense of people want answers. People want to understand why it happened, especially why it happened in Southport, why it happened to our friends, our families, our kids, our community. Because it makes no sense in my world, in my life, because these sort of things don't happen around the corner from where we live. I've lived in London before, and even then you kind of expect, you know, higher crime rates and stuff, but even nothing like this. So there's a general feeling of, I guess, frustration, and there will be anger.
You've mentioned the riots that took place here in Southport a couple of times in our conversation now. How did that affect the community? Because I know from being here and talking to people at the time, they said to me, not in our name. These people are not from Southport. They do not represent how we are feeling. They do not act on our behalf.
We were surprised, we were shocked, we were angry of why people have come into our town to do this. And through, it's en route to my gym. So the next morning I was going to the gym, as I would do normally, and I couldn't get past because all the roads had closed off because of how big the riot was in the end. So I saw one of my friends, and he mentioned, he's cleaning the streets, so he mentioned you've got to do what you can for your community. So I went back home, I picked up a brush, a bucket and a shovel, and then I shoveled and I cleaned, and I made sure that I did whatever I could, because it was self-healing for me, knowing that this tragedy, this horrible event has happened, as well as the stupidity of the riots afterwards. But you need to do something to help your community. You need to do something to clean it up. It was better for me, but the riots, we just want nothing to do with it now. It's been there, it's gone.
You certainly don't want to see any more come
not
from
at all.
sentencing
No.
or what's happening this week?
No, nothing at all. It's horrible to think that people are smashing up their own town, their own community, and Southport's not like that.
You talk about your roundtable, your community group that is raising funds for those affected and continues to do so nearly 6 months on. How is it that you want to help the families? What does the money that comes into you do for them?
We didn't really know how to help them to begin with, so we set up this GoFundMe page for donations, and it was only until a couple of days afterwards, it was a mechanic really for the whole of the UK to channel funds, donations into the page to help these families. The families, we've set aside 2 donations towards them. They've been provided the money, and through doing so, we don't ask where the money's gone. We've spoken to a few of the families, and how we've worded it to our friends, colleagues and relatives is they've used that money to build new memories, to help their families recover from what's happened.
A final question, Mark, because a line will be drawn this week after sentencing, and the Southport attacker who came here to attack your community will go to prison for a long time. What's next for Southport? After this line is drawn, what happens to the community?
It's always going to be there as a tainted memory towards Southport. But what's next is rebuilding and moving on and trying to live our lives and be part of the community more. So for the Southport Heads of the Round Table, we'll be putting on further events this year and just bringing smiles and joy to the people. That's all we can do.
Well, of course, Axel Rudakubana's murderous rampage wasn't the only trauma suffered by Southport last summer. In its wake, there were riots across the country. They were particularly painful here, coming just days after the attacks. Well, let's bring in Stephen Petchy, who was one of the first people on the scene following the awful riots here in Southport, a member of the community, which so many people I spoke to in those days, Stephen, said the reaction to the attacks from the community and the reaction to those riots that came to your doorstep, that's what Southport is about, rolling up your sleeves and looking after each other.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's just amazing on the morning after the riots, how many people, from old-age people to young children, 6, 7 years old, came out to really help with the clean-up operation. And it was okay for us as a company to come in, but you need 30, 40, 50 people to do the operation, and the local community was absolutely superb coming together.
Yeah, I should say you're a contract manager for Sefton at Dow High Civil Engineering, so you have experience in the clean-up, but there were people, I remember there were young girls coming out with dustpan and brushes onto the street. It was all hands on deck.
Yeah, it was amazing to see. There was one girl, she was 7 years old, holding the dustpan, and her brother brushing the debris up into it. And it was just absolutely fantastic to see. And also the local businesses as well, because it was a really hot day that day. Yeah. And they were bringing out bottles of water, sandwiches, you know, to keep all the volunteers going was fantastic.
Stephen, that's the backdrop, that's the community here, that's the backdrop to this heinous attack that happened here.
Yeah.
And 48 hours later, riots come here to your town. Now, for those who haven't been to Southport, it's a gorgeous seaside town. You know, people come here to retire. Young people bring their young families here to raise them.
Yeah.
You know, we've painted a picture of that community. So just give us an idea of the sense of shock of that week that could come here to Southport.
Yeah, it's a lovely seaside town, which in the summertime is great for the holidaymakers coming. The local fun fair is busy all the time. And it's a real holiday town by the sea. And you just don't expect anything like that to happen at all. The horrible attacks is one thing, but for the riots to happen afterwards was just such a shock for everyone. For that.
And the message has been from the people of Southport, don't shy away from us. Please still come to Southport, because you don't want to be defined by the events of last summer.
Exactly. It's, you know, you don't see Southport on the news that often at all. And to be across the world's news with those attacks, it's not the image of Southport. It's not what the local people want to see at all. And it's now a chance to put that behind us. We won't forget, but it's a chance to try and, you know, build the community spirit that we had and take it forward that we should do.
Yeah. Are you supportive of a public inquiry? Because people still want answers, but with a public inquiry comes again that kind of focus on this town.
It does because we do need answers as to what the breakdown was for this to happen. You know, the authorities may have been able to prevent this happening. So yes, it will continue to bring Southport in the light in that respect. But I think we do need answers as to how this happened.
Stephen, thank you for coming to talk to us tonight. Okay. Stephen Pecci there, contract manager for Sefton at Dow High Civil Engineering, you know, one of the first on the scene clearing up after the riots that took place in this town last summer in the aftermath of the attacks. We'll take a look at what is next for this town and its people following today's sentencing of Axel Rudakubana. That's coming up after the break.
Saturday, exclusively on Peacock. Two clubs aim desperately to climb up the Premier League table.
It's a chance for Erling Haaland, just phenomenal.
Manchester City.
And that's a beautiful finish.
Chelsea. This is the Premier League. Saturday, only on Peacock.
I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We'd been warned that we would meet people in the lowest moment of their lives.
Their story is one of fundamental American failure. Well, a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club, but I have to say there are more media here than there are supporters.
We love Trump!
I've witnessed the remarkable passion for politics here, but the anger too. This is just the audience that Joe Biden wanted.
Is this the moment to reform gun laws?
You know, it's easy to go to politics.
But it's important, it's at the heart of the issue.
For all the talk of a toned-down, humbled Trump, yes, maybe there was just a little less rhetoric, a little less divisiveness, but in the end it was the same rhythm, the same speech, the same man.
All them people that died in Russia and Ukraine, they'd still be alive today if Donald Trump was president.
If it was my wish, have a businessman that's strong like Trump, but maybe just doesn't say as much, you know?
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What we've been allowed to see over here is a humanitarian corridor, free wherever you get your news.
A young American medical student is making remarkable things happen.
I've seen a lot of difficult things, and honestly, it breaks my heart. These children don't deserve that.
I don't think there's a single Arab I know who isn't seriously disturbed by what's going on.
And so they gathered for this wonder of nature.
I'm very excited right now.
This is an extraordinary moment beyond anything I could have expected. Sky News, get the full story first.
Welcome back to a special UK Tonight live from Southport this evening. I'm alongside our Chief North of England correspondent Greg Milam and our crime correspondent Martin Brunt, both following this story throughout the course of the day. A lot has been packed into today. We were preparing ourselves this week for a 4 to 6 week trial. Greg, I know you were in court at what you thought would be the start of that trial, and it ended up that it was moved to today. We had the hearing and the sentencing, and now that chapter has closed. Greg, your final thoughts on what we have learnt today, because there has been so much to take in, so much of it distressing, and this is a community that has had to process a lot in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely relief that we didn't have to sit through that trial, but of course what we heard today was a summary of what we would have heard over the next 4 to 6 weeks. I think there's relief that this phase of it is over, that the town can move on, although of course we have the public inquiry still to come. I think there are still questions, and maybe they'll get those answers in the public inquiry. One question still they don't have answers to here is why it was here. They don't know why Rudakubana chose that location, those girls. We know that it seems he thought about another possible target the week before, but I think the town wants to know what the reason was, why he came here, why he did what he did. And I think for those families, what's happened today has happened. That phase has ended, but of course their grief hasn't. And that will live on for who knows how long. And I think people here hold those families very much in their thoughts.
Yeah, very much so. And the focus on those 3 little girls that were killed on that day last summer. Martin, we followed all the twists and turns in real time from outside Liverpool Crown Court today, and a lot of that detail being heard for the first time, not just in the public domain, but for the families inside that courtroom.
Yes, we've learned an awful lot since Monday, since those guilty pleas. So it wasn't quite clear what new material would have, or what new information would emerge today. But I think there were some striking moments when we heard for the first time that Rudakubana had actually called Childline himself and said to them, look, what do you do? What do I do when I want to kill people? And then confessed to them, those organisers of Childline, that he'd been to school. He was angry at people at school who'd been bullying him. He'd taken a knife into the school. And of course, this was reported, and that did prompt one of the interactions with the police, and he ended up admitting having carried a knife 10 times. Some of that detail we'd already known. But it's information like that, and I guess a lot's been said about all these interactions. Why on earth wasn't he stopped? But if you look at each interaction, I'm still puzzled about what you could have done to foresee 5-6 years later that it would end up with this terrible massacre of young girls. Now, we've got all these inquiries. Greg's mentioned the public inquiry. We've got a review of the PREVENT system. We've got a new definition of terror, perhaps, that's going to be discussed. It's difficult to think that something won't emerge from all of that that will teach the authorities in some way how to deal with a very young teenager who's obsessed with extreme violence and stop another Rudakubana committing something very similar.
Martin Brunt, Greg Bylam, it's been a long day for everyone involved. Thank you for your final thoughts. And as Greg said, our thoughts very much with the families and the community here in Southport, those affected. Rudakubana is going to prison for the rest of his life, potentially, as the judge said, a sentence of life with a minimum of 52 years. But let's end tonight by remembering the 3 girls who lost their lives, who the community of Southport want you to focus on tonight: Elsie Dot Stankham, Alice Da Silva Aguiar and BB King.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, it would appear, is about to learn his fate. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. Sky News, get the full story first. Do you fear a 4th indictment?
He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.